This particular study is very, very in depth. Okay, so pull out your worksheet and get ready for me to be saying a lot. So much that forgive me, I'm just going to have to read, and because it's just a lot of information today. So we're in the study 6, which is on discernment, and it's Genesis 41 through 41:32. And the purpose is to demonstrate that the person of integrity will often have the opportunity to speak into the lives of others, which includes both good news and bad news. Now, a general note, dreams and their interpretations play a very significant role in the Bible and specifically in the lives of the characters of the book of Genesis. God preserved Sarah, Abraham's wife, through a dream that warned King Abimelech, and that's in Genesis 23 and 6. Jacob's life is marked by the dream that showed. Also, there's Jacob's life, is marked by the dream that showed him the ladder into heaven, and that's Genesis 28:10 through 15. Other dreams, Genesis 31:10 through 11, as well as encounters with God in Genesis 32:22, made Jacob sensitive to the intervention of God through the miraculous and thus more pensive about Joseph's dream. So you remember when we were studying about how Jacob was a little, when Joseph talked about his dream, he didn't put that aside. He was taken aback by it, but he didn't rule it out that there might be something to it. Now, Joseph's life is about dreams, both his own and of those around him. The cupbearer, the baker, and the Pharaoh. His ability with interpreting messages of God reveals that Joseph listened to the Spirit of God, who in turn made him wise and discerning. So, question 1. The king of Egypt, who will also be referred to as Pharaoh, is angry. We don't know why, but the fact that the two who go to prison are the cupbearer and the baker implies that he was dissatisfied with something related to a feast. The Pharaoh was absolutely powerful, and so if his wine was bitter or his toast was burnt, he could send those men to prison. And with the snap of the fingers, he could also have them executed. The cupbearer was Pharaoh's confidant and sat with Pharaoh throughout the day. The chief baker worked for the cupbearer, thus the phrase, his baker, in Genesis 41. The way the story turns out indicates that these two were in prison for a culinary mistake, and they're placed into prison until fault is assigned to one or the other. Both of these men entered prison terrified because they knew the power the Pharaoh had to execute them at a whim. And they both have dreams they cannot figure out, and they are troubled. Genesis 46. And visibly distressed. Genesis 48. A dream was seen as a message from the spirit world, but if it went uninterpreted, the dreamer had no recourse but to worry that it meant bad news. In that context, Joseph went as a servant. He observed their distress and offered himself as the discerning voice of God. Question 3. There are two things to note about Joseph's offer to hear the dreams. First, he offered himself, but he acknowledged absolute dependency on God. Genesis 48. Second, he offered himself and confidently asserted that God was the interpreter of the dreams. Yet, to the best of our knowledge, Joseph lived with the daily reminder that he had dreams of his own that were uninterpreted and unfulfilled. Question 4. People of the day often saw their dreams as bad omens, as warnings from the netherworld. Thus, the cupbearer's positive interpretation from Joseph gave the baker confidence that his dream's meaning was likewise positive. The translation of the dream dashed these hopes. Question 5. These verses provide one of the very few glimpses of Joseph's perspective of his circumstance. He asked the cupbearer to show him kindness and speak on his behalf of his unjust imprisonment. He recounted his story of being stolen from the land of the Hebrews. 14 reflects a bit of depression. The wording an urgent plea, "Get me out of here." No one was closer to Pharaoh than the chief cupbearer, and Joseph knew that if the cupbearer represented him favorably to Pharaoh, his chances of being released increased dramatically. Question 6. In the Hebrew Bible, repeating a phrase was a way of emphasizing its intensity. Note that both Joseph and Pharaoh's dreams come in repeated pairs. This twofold emphasis occurs in Genesis 40:23. The summary underscores the disappointment that Joseph must have felt because the phrase is repeated. He did not remember him. He forgot him. Joseph could have sunk into despair because he knew as the days after the cupbearer's relief lengthened that his request had been ignored. He was stuck. Change of location for question 7. It's getting a little cold outside, so and let me just begin to wrap it up. So we were saying that he was stuck in prison, and it's becoming daunting, very depressing, and he's still trying to keep his spirits up, but he's only human, right? So question 7, it's interesting to note that in Genesis 4:1, it emphasizes the reality of how Joseph was forgotten in the use of the word full, saying, when 2 full years had passed, reminding the reader of Joseph's endurance. Question 8. In Genesis 41:16, Joseph reiterates his earlier statement in Genesis 48 that the interpretation of dreams belongs to God. And as the voice of God, Joseph promised Pharaoh God's peace, shalom, Genesis 41:16. The reality that the Lord was with Joseph played out again in Joseph's ability to discern the messages that God was sending through these dreams. So the cupbearer did more than test wines and other beverages. He served as Pharaoh's right-hand man and his constant attendant. Joseph stood before Pharaoh, the cupbearer, whom Joseph served in prison and had forgotten Joseph for full 2 years, would have been standing there beside him. The miraculous ability of Joseph to forgive those who had hurt him manifests itself here as he maintained silence toward the cupbearer. Question 10. Joseph's interpretation of the baker's dream, Genesis 40:16 through 19, illustrated that Joseph was willing to bring good news and bad news. He saw himself only as the mouthpiece of God, delivering the interpretations that the Spirit of God gave him. To tell Pharaoh, who could execute a man for burning his toast, that 7 years of famine and hardship were coming might have created a desire in Joseph to soften his message, but Joseph would never back down. Questions 11 through 12. Why are we not more like Joseph? Joseph is a model to emulate. His dependency on God, his belief that God was with him, his faith and his confidence that God was speaking all provide exemplary traits for us to imitate. Now, discernment is a biblically desirable trait that is often ignored in our contemporary teaching and Christian growth. Hebrews 5:14 emphasizes the role of experience, practice, and even mistakes as God's tools to help us discern good versus evil.